Hi, I'm Sherlock. Welcome to my new mystery case.
Of all the cases in which my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes has employed his singular powers, there are some whose chief merit lies not in the magnitude of the crime, but in the delicacy with which the truth is disentangled from a web of seemingly impossible circumstances. The autumn fog of 1891 hung thick over Baker Street like a suffocating shroud, muffling the clip-clop of horse hooves and the distant cries of street vendors, when such a case presented itself to us on a grey October morning that I shall not soon forget. Holmes had been unusually restless since dawn, wrapped in his old blue dressing gown, his long, eager fingers tracing lines through the morning papers with an absorption that suggested he was searching for something beyond the mundane reports of parliamentary debates and shipping news. The fire had burned low in the grate, and I was on the point of rising to mend it when the sound of a hansom drew up before our door, followed by an urgent ring at the bell that brought Mrs. Hudson hurrying with an expression of considerable agitation. A moment later she ushered in a lady closely veiled, behind whom the familiar thin figure of Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard presented itself with an air of professional gravity mixed with obvious perplexity. The lady had drawn aside her veil to reveal a face of perhaps 26 years, pale from want of sleep, and of that refined and resolute type which English households sometimes produce in their orphaned nieces and elder daughters. Her dark eyes were overbright with suppressed emotion, and there was a firmness about her mouth that was belied by the trembling of her gloved hands. "Mr. Holmes," said Lestrade, with a little bow that included me, "I have taken upon myself to bring Miss Quinton straight to you. It is not a matter in which I have very much faith, I confess, but there are circumstances so singular that I thought your attention might be profitably engaged." The inspector's usual confidence seemed somewhat shaken, and I noted the way his eyes avoided direct contact with Holmes's penetrating gaze. Holmes turned from the window with that fluid grace I had observed so many times before, his grey eyes immediately fixing upon our visitors with the intensity of a hawk sighting its prey. "Miss Clara Quinton of Marchmont Street," he said without preamble, causing the young lady to start visibly. "I perceive that you have had little sleep, that you are recently bereaved of a guardian, and that the matter which brings you here concerns not theft or common violence, but something far more disturbing to the rational mind." Miss Quinton gripped the back of the nearest chair for support, her composure wavering. "How could you possibly know my name or circumstances, Mr. Holmes? We have never met, and I am quite certain that Inspector Lestrade mentioned neither." Holmes waved a dismissive hand as he gestured for her to be seated beside the fire. "The mourning band upon your sleeve, though partially concealed, speaks to recent loss, while your bearing suggests one accustomed to responsibility beyond her years. The particular type of clay upon your boots is found in the garden squares of Marchmont Street, and your evident distress, combined with Lestrade's presence, indicates a matter that has baffled conventional investigation." As Miss Quinton settled into the chair, she drew a steadying breath and began her extraordinary tale. "You are quite correct in all particulars, Mr. Holmes. I am Clara Quinton, and I have come to you because what I am about to relate will sound like the ravings of a person whose reason has been overthrown by grief and shock. My uncle, Mr. Bartholomew Quinton, was found dead in his library at 12:30 last night. But that is not the strangest part of this terrible business. There was a bell ringing, Mr. Holmes, from beneath the very floorboards of the room." Holmes's eyes sharpened with that familiar glint of intellectual curiosity. "Under the floor, you say? Pray continue with your account, Miss Quinton. Leave out no detail, however trivial it may seem." She told her story with admirable composure, though I could see the effort it cost her. Mr. Bartholomew Quinton, a retired barrister of comfortable means and passionate antiquary, had for 15 years occupied a Georgian house in Marchmont Street. The previous evening he had dined alone and retired at 10 to his ground-floor library to work on his notes regarding a recent acquisition. Besides Miss Quinton herself, the household consisted of Nash, the butler, who had served for 2 years, and Eliza, the housemaid. The coachman slept over the mews and had not entered the main house since 7 o'clock. I was reading in my room when a most peculiar sound reached me, Miss Quinton continued, her voice steady despite the obvious strain. It was unlike any bell I had heard before, thin and distant, yet unmistakably clear. It reminded me of a convent bell, if you can imagine such a thing, with none of the bright shake of our servants' bells. It came at intervals, 3 or 4 strokes, followed by silence, and though I initially thought it must be from the street, it was plainly within the house itself. She paused, gathering herself before continuing. Eliza had heard it too, and we met Nash coming up from the basement stairs with a candle and a face as white as chalk. "Do you hear it, miss?" he cried. "As I'm a Christian man, it's coming from below the floor." We all had the same impression, Mr. Holmes. The sound seemed to emanate from beneath the library itself. "You investigated immediately?" Holmes inquired, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. The library door was ajar, and there was a curious smell in the passage, something sharp and metallic, like the air after lightning. We entered together and found my uncle at his writing desk, his head resting upon his folded arms as if sleep had overcome him. The bell had ceased the moment we crossed the threshold. When we tried to rouse him, we discovered that he was dead. Miss Quinton's voice faltered slightly, but she pressed on with admirable determination. Nash stepped toward the fireplace and slipped upon a smear of damp clay that lay upon the hearth rug near the skirting. Dr. Alderdice, who lives in the next square, pronounced that my uncle had died of syncope, some failure of the heart. It is true that he had suffered one seizure a year ago, but he had been most careful with his health of late. Lestrade, who had been standing with barely concealed scepticism, now spoke up. "It's the oddest business I've encountered in 20 years, Mr. Holmes. I was on the scene within the hour. The library has no communication with the cellar except through ordinary joists and laths. The cellar is used for coal storage, well filled and undisturbed. No trapdoors, no signs of any person having been there. The area gate was bolted from within. I've had the floorboards sounded and examined, and they're as solid as the day they were laid." Holmes leaned forward with interest. "You mentioned a recent acquisition, Miss Quinton. Your uncle was a collector of antiquities?" Her face brightened slightly. "Indeed. It was a small handbell, Mr. Holmes. My uncle believed it to be from the dissolved Carmelite house that once stood where our street now stands. A dealer named Mr. Silas Venn had been pressing him to sell it, and they had words yesterday afternoon. Mr. Venn left in considerable anger when my uncle refused his offer." "Most illuminating," Holmes murmured. "And this bell, where is it now?" "Upon the mantelpiece in the library, where my uncle always kept it. It is of bronze, greenish with age, and bears a small cross carved upon its lip. My uncle would never allow it to be rung, saying it should remain silent." Holmes rose abruptly from his chair, his eyes taking on that distant look I knew so well. "Miss Quinton, you were quite right to come to us. Inspector Lestrade, I assume you will permit me to examine the scene?" "Certainly, Mr. Holmes, though I warn you that you'll find nothing we haven't already discovered." As our visitors prepared to depart, Holmes turned to me with that slight smile that always preceded his most remarkable deductions. "A bell that rings from beneath the floor, Watson, heard by 3 independent witnesses, and ceasing upon the entrance of a fourth. A smell suggesting electrical discharge, damp clay within doors, and the convenient death of a man who possessed something another desired greatly. Our clients bring us what appears to be supernatural, but I suspect we shall find a very human hand behind this particular haunting. He moved to the window, gazing out at the fog-shrouded street with the intensity of a general surveying a battlefield. There is more mischief in a thin wire than in a bludgeon, my dear fellow, and I believe we shall discover that this bell has indeed tolled, but not for the dead. Rather, it has rung to summon us to one of the most ingenious crimes it has been my privilege to investigate. Within the quarter hour we were seated in a hansom bound for Marchmont Street. Holmes wrapped in thoughtful silence as the fog-shrouded streets of Bloomsbury rolled past our windows. I had donned my heaviest coat against the autumn chill, and as I settled back against the leather cushions, Holmes turned from his contemplation of the passing scene with that slight smile I knew so well. "You have been reading the morning edition of the Times rather hastily, Watson," he observed without preamble. "Indeed, you were so absorbed by the account of the Whitechapel incident that you neglected to properly fold the paper when finished." I glanced down at the newspaper protruding from my coat pocket, its pages still bearing the telltale creases of hurried perusal. "Your powers of observation never cease to amaze me, Holmes, though I confess I fail to see how you could deduce my reading habits from such trivial evidence. The ink smudge upon your right thumb, still faintly visible despite your attempts to clean it, corresponds precisely to the quality used by the Times printing house. The particular pattern of creases in the visible portion of the paper indicates it was read in sections rather than methodically, and the slight displacement of pages suggests your attention was captured by something on an inner leaf, causing you to abandon your usual orderly approach." He leaned back with satisfaction as our hansom turned into the quieter precincts of Marchmont Street. "Consider, my dear fellow, how sound travels through timber when the frequency is precisely calibrated. Wood conducts vibration far more efficiently than air under certain conditions, and a skilled practitioner might exploit such principles to remarkable effect. The Georgian terrace that housed the late Mr. Quinton presented a respectable facade, its brick darkened by decades of London smoke, but maintaining the dignified proportions of its era. Miss Quinton met us at the door, her composure admirable despite the evident strain of the past hours, while Lestrade awaited us in the hallway with an expression of professional scepticism barely held in check. "I've examined every inch of that library again this morning, Mr. Holmes," the inspector declared, as he led us toward the rear of the house. The floorboards are solid oak over conventional joists, and there's nothing beneath them but ordinary space. Whatever these people heard, it didn't come from any bell hidden under the floor. The library itself proved a comfortable apartment with tall windows overlooking a modest garden, its walls lined with leather-bound volumes that spoke to the deceased's scholarly pursuits. Holmes moved immediately to the mantelpiece, where the bronze bell sat among various antiquarian objects, lifting it with the delicate touch of a connoisseur. 13th century, undoubtedly, he murmured, turning, the artifact in the pale light filtering through the windows. The patina is genuine, and there are traces of ancient wax within the bronze. Your uncle possessed excellent judgment, Miss Quinton. He was most particular about authenticity, she replied. Mr. Venn had offered a considerable sum, but my uncle suspected the man's motives were not entirely scholarly. Holmes replaced the bell carefully and knelt beside the hearthrug, where the smear of clay that had caused Nash to slip remained clearly visible. He produced his magnifying glass and studied the substance with characteristic thoroughness, even scraping a small sample into an envelope. "Most interesting," he observed. This clay contains traces of organic matter suggesting recent disturbance, yet it is not garden soil, something from a deeper source, I should judge. Rising to his feet, he began a methodical examination of the room's perimeter, his movements those of a bloodhound following an elusive scent. Near the corner, farthest from the door, he paused and beckoned me to join him, his finger indicating a section of skirting that appeared identical to all the rest. "What do you observe here, Watson?" I examined the woodwork carefully, but could detect nothing unusual. "It appears perfectly ordinary to me, Holmes." "Precisely," he replied with quiet satisfaction. "Everything else in this room bears the patina of age and use, yet this particular section has been recently disturbed. Note how the paint sits differently upon the wood, and observe these almost imperceptible scratches near the floor line." He knelt and withdrew a thin probe from his waistcoat, gently exploring the junction between skirting and floor. A moment later he straightened, holding between his fingers a strand so fine it was barely visible, gleaming dully in the lamplight. "Copper wire, Watson, no thicker than a human hair, and recently severed." His grey eyes took on that familiar intensity as he examined the thread more closely. "Our mysterious bell ringer has left us a calling card, though I suspect he never intended such evidence to survive his handiwork." Lestrade stepped forward, his skepticism wavering. But how could such a thing produce the sound they described? Holmes smiled enigmatically as he carefully preserved the wire fragment. "All in good time, Inspector. First, I believe we must pay a visit to your cellar." Nash led our descent into the cellar with evident reluctance, his bull's-eye lantern casting wavering shadows against the whitewashed brick walls as we made our way down the steep wooden steps. The air grew markedly colder as we descended, carrying with it the familiar sense of coal dust and that peculiar, earthy dampness one encounters in cellars long sealed from natural light. Miss Quinton followed close behind, her composure admirable despite the obvious strain of the past hours, while Lestrade brought up the rear with the confident stride of a man certain that conventional investigation would prevail over Holmes's more esoteric methods. The cellar extended beneath the entire house, its flagstone floor supporting neat pyramids of coal against the far wall, and various household stores arranged with the methodical precision that spoke well of Nash's management. At first glance, Lestrade's confidence appeared justified, for nothing seemed disturbed in the orderly arrangement of domestic necessities that filled the underground space. "You see, Mr. Holmes," the inspector declared with renewed satisfaction, "there has been no disturbance here whatsoever. The coal remains exactly as it was stacked months ago, the walls show no signs of recent work, and the area gate has remained bolted from within since my last inspection." Holmes, however, had moved with characteristic purpose toward the section directly beneath where the library would be situated above our heads. He knelt upon the flagstones with his magnifying glass, paying particular attention to the ancient mortar between the stones and the stout oak joists that supported the floor above. The lamplight revealed what our less trained eyes had missed, a fine coating of dust that, while appearing uniform at casual inspection, showed distinct patterns of recent disturbance when examined with proper attention to detail. "Watson," Holmes called softly, "would you be so good as to examine these ceiling joists with particular care? I believe you will find something of considerable interest directly above where I am kneeling." I raised Nash's lantern and studied the timber framework with growing fascination. The wood appeared sound and showed the natural settling one would expect in a house of such vintage. Yet as I moved the light methodically along the beams, a small irregularity caught my attention. "There appears to be a hole drilled through this particular joist," I observed. indicating a spot no larger than a crown piece. It has been carefully plugged with some dark substance, but the surrounding wood shows clear evidence of recent work. Excellent, Watson. Holmes rose from his examination of the flagstones, his eyes bright with the satisfaction of confirmed hypothesis. And what manner of substance would you judge has been used to conceal this modification? Before I could venture a response, he had produced his delicate probe and was working carefully at the filled aperture. After a moment's precise manipulation, a plug of dark wax fell into his palm, revealing the narrow tunnel beneath. He immediately produced a length of string from his pocket, tied a small weight to one end, and fed it through the hole with the delicacy of a surgeon performing an operation. We heard the faint scratch of the weight descending through the cavity between floor and ceiling, followed by a soft metallic chime as it struck something below. Holmes's smile was one of quiet triumph as he carefully withdrew the string, examining the weight for any traces it might have collected during its brief journey. "The mystery begins to resolve itself," he announced, turning his attention to the section of brick wall directly beneath where the drilled hole had been discovered. Here his magnifying glass revealed what appeared to be perfectly ordinary masonry, yet his trained eye detected the subtle signs that escaped our notice. Observe, if you will, how the mortar between these particular bricks differs slightly in colour from that surrounding them. Fresh lime bears a different hue from that which has aged for decades. With his penknife, he worked delicately at the mortar line until a thin section came away, revealing not solid masonry, but a carefully concealed cavity beyond. Within this space, the lamplight illuminated the remnants of what had clearly been a sophisticated mechanism, fragments of copper wire, traces of a white, crystalline substance that Holmes identified as the residue of a Leclanché cell, and most tellingly, the clear impressions where metal components had rested against the brick. "A galvanic battery," Holmes explained, his voice carrying that note of professional admiration he reserved for particularly clever criminal enterprises. "Compact, reliable, and capable of providing the electrical current necessary to operate a small electromagnet." The sharp, metallic odor Miss Quinton detected was the characteristic scent of electrical discharge, while the copper wire we discovered upstairs formed part of a circuit designed to activate this mechanism from above. Miss Quinton stepped closer, her scientific curiosity overcoming her natural distress. "But how could such a device produce the sound we heard, Mr. Holmes? Surely no mechanism hidden in these walls could create the clear bell tone that rang through the house." "Indeed it could not," Holmes agreed, "if the intention were to create sound directly. However, our perpetrator possessed a more sophisticated understanding of acoustics and mechanical advantage. The electromagnet, when activated by electrical current, would exert a powerful attractive force upon any ferrous metal within its range. The ancient bell upon your uncle's mantelpiece, being of bronze with iron impurities, would respond to such magnetic influence." He gestured toward the ceiling above our heads, where the drilled hole provided a direct path between the hidden mechanism and the library floor. A thin copper wire, threaded through this aperture and concealed beneath the skirting board, would complete a circuit when touched or stepped upon. The resulting magnetic pulse would draw the bell sharply downward against the mantelpiece, producing exactly the tone you described, while creating the illusion that the sound emanated from beneath the floor itself. Lestrade, who had been following this explanation with growing interest, now leaned forward with professional intensity. "But surely such an elaborate arrangement suggests more than mere mischief, Mr. Holmes. What purpose could it serve? Could it, beyond frightening the household?" Holmes's expression grew grave as he carefully collected the evidence scattered about the hidden cavity. A most astute observation, Inspector. The creation of supernatural manifestation serves to distract attention from more mundane forms of criminal activity. Someone required the household to be absent from the library at a specific time, someone who needed Mr. Quinton's death to appear natural while concealing their true purpose in this room. As we prepared to ascend from the cellar, Holmes paused at the base of the stairs and examined the flagstones with renewed attention. There, pressed into the ancient mortar, were the clear impressions of boot heels bearing the distinctive pattern of machine-made pegs. More significantly, one heel showed a characteristic nick at its outer edge, a mark that would prove invaluable in identifying our quarry. The clay upon the hearthrug above, Holmes observed, scraping a sample of the same distinctive earth from between the flagstones, was carried upon these very boots. Our perpetrator made multiple visits to this cellar, perfecting his mechanism and ensuring its reliable operation. He was methodical, patient, and possessed of considerable technical knowledge. Upon our return to the library, Holmes moved immediately to the writing desk where Mr. Quinton had been discovered. With his knife blade, he carefully lifted the leather blotter, revealing beneath it a small area of discoloration, and more significantly, a series of tiny burn marks along the brass edge of the desk itself. "The final piece of our puzzle," he announced with quiet satisfaction. "These marks indicate electrical contact, Watson. Our victim did not merely die of natural causes while the bell rang below. He was part of the circuit itself, and his death was as carefully orchestrated as the supernatural manifestation that preceded it." Miss Quinton's face had grown pale with understanding. "You mean that my uncle was deliberately killed by this electrical device?" "I mean that we are dealing with a murder of exceptional sophistication," Holmes replied gently. "Someone who understood both the mechanical principles necessary to create the bell-ringing illusion and the electrical knowledge required to deliver a fatal shock. We are not seeking a common criminal, but a man of education and technical expertise." He moved to the window, his keen eyes surveying the fog-shrouded street with the intensity of a general planning his campaign. "Inspector Lestrade, I believe it is time we paid our visit to Mr. Silas Venn. Unless I am much mistaken, we shall find that our antiquarian dealer possesses not only a passionate interest in medieval artifacts, but also a most uncommon familiarity with the principles of electrical science." The address Miss Quinton had provided led us through the narrow, fog-shrouded streets of Clerkenwell, where the ancient trades of clockmaking and metalwork still flourished alongside newer enterprises dealing in scientific apparatus and electrical curiosities. Our hansom deposited us before a cramped establishment squeezed between a chronometer maker and a dealer in optical instruments, its grimy windows displaying an eclectic array of artifacts that spoke to the occupants' wide-ranging interests in both antiquity and modernity. Holmes paused before the entrance, his keen eyes taking in every detail of the shop front with characteristic thoroughness. The brass nameplate read S. Venn, Antiquarian and Curiosities, while smaller lettering beneath advertised electrical apparatus and historical authentication. This dual nature of the business seemed to confirm his growing suspicions about our quarry's unusual combination of scholarly pursuits and technical expertise. The bell above the door announced our entry into an interior that resembled nothing so much as a museum fallen into scholarly chaos. Medieval manuscripts lay scattered among coils of copper wire, while ancient pottery competed for shelf space with gleaming brass instruments and glass vessels containing various chemical solutions. The air carried a complex mixture of scents, old parchment, metal polish, and that distinctive sharp odor I had learned to associate with electrical experimentation. From behind a towering bookshelf emerged a man of perhaps 45 years, his lean frame clothed in a worn velvet jacket that had seen better days. His pale, scholarly features bore the cast of one who's spent long hours bent over books and delicate instruments, while his dark eyes held an intelligence that was immediately apparent despite his attempt at casual friendliness. Most significantly to my trained observation, his hands bore the telltale stains of chemical work, and there were small burn marks on his fingers that spoke to frequent handling of electrical apparatus. "Gentlemen," Venn greeted us with a slight bow that encompassed our entire party, "how may I be of service? I confess you find my establishment in some disorder, as I have been reorganizing my collection of scientific instruments." His voice carried the cultured tones of university education, yet there was an underlying tension that suggested our arrival was not entirely unexpected. Holmes moved through the cluttered space with the fluid grace of a connoisseur, his attention apparently caught by various displays while his keen eyes catalogued every detail of the shop's contents. Near a workbench at the rear of the establishment, he paused beside an array of electrical components that included several coils of the same hair-thin copper wire we had discovered in Quinton's library. "A fascinating collection, Mr. Venn," Holmes observed, with apparent casualness. "I perceive that your interests extend far beyond the merely antiquarian into the realm of modern scientific investigation. This copper wire, for instance, appears to be of exceptional quality and fineness." "Indeed," Venn replied, his gaze following Holmes's movements with barely concealed wariness. "The authentication of historical artifacts often requires the application of modern scientific principles. Electrical testing can reveal much about the composition and age of metallic objects that conventional examination might miss." Lestrade stepped forward with characteristic directness. "Mr. Venn, we are investigating the death of Mr. Bartholomew Quinton. I understand you had recent business dealings with the deceased gentleman, and that your final meeting was somewhat acrimonious." Venn's composure wavered almost imperceptibly, a reaction that did not escape Holmes's notice. "A most unfortunate occurrence," he replied, with what appeared to be genuine regret. "Mr. Quinton was a scholar of considerable discrimination, though we did not always agree regarding the proper valuation of certain artifacts. Our discussion yesterday was spirited, certainly, but hardly grounds for the sort of criminal suspicion your presence implies." Holmes had positioned himself near the workbench, where a partially dismantled Leclanche cell sat among various tools and components. More significantly, a small tin of dark, viscous wax sat open nearby, its color and consistency identical to the substance we had removed from the drilled joist in Quinton's cellar. "You appear to be something of an electrical experimenter yourself," Holmes observed, lifting a small electromagnet from among the scattered components. "This is particularly well constructed. Your own work, I presume?" "A necessary skill in my profession," Venn admitted, moving closer with obvious concern for his apparatus. "Many collectors fail to appreciate how galvanic testing can authenticate the magnetic properties of ancient metals. The applications are quite remarkable when properly understood." Holmes set down the electromagnet and turned his attention to a collection of medieval bells displayed upon a nearby shelf. Each bore the characteristic patina of age, yet his trained eye immediately detected subtle differences in their construction and provenance. "You specialize in ecclesiastical items, I see. The bell in Mr. Quinton's possession must have been particularly desirable to warrant your persistent interest." "The Carmelite bell was indeed exceptional," Venn replied, his voice taking on the passionate tone of the true collector. 13th century, unquestionably authentic, and bearing inscriptions of considerable historical significance. Mr. Quinton's refusal to consider any reasonable offer was most disappointing. As this exchange continued, I observed Holmes's attention shift to the floor near the workbench, where his sharp eyes had detected something that escaped our notice. Kneeling with apparent casualness, he examined the flagstones with his magnifying glass, paying particular attention to traces of the same distinctive clay we had discovered in Quinton's cellar. "Your recent work appears to have taken you into rather specialized environments," Holmes remarked, rising from his examination. "This clay, for instance, is not common London earth, but something far more particular in its composition." Venn's face had grown noticeably paler, yet he maintained his scholarly composure with admirable determination. "I occasionally require specific materials for my authentication work. Certain pottery glazes, for instance, can only be properly analyzed using clay samples from their original sources." Holmes nodded thoughtfully, then moved toward a young man who had been quietly arranging artifacts in a corner display case. The lad, perhaps 19 years of age, wore the simple clothes of a shop assistant, and his boots showed the characteristic machine-made pegging that had caught Holmes's attention in the cellar. More significantly, the outer heel of the left boot bore a distinctive nick that matched perfectly the impression we had discovered in the Quinton cellar. "Your assistant, I presume?" Holmes inquired pleasantly. "Stephen Bixby," Venn replied with obvious reluctance. "He has been with me for several months, helping with deliveries and the heavier work." Holmes addressed the young man directly. "Mr. Bixby, I trust your duties occasionally take you to clients' homes for the installation of electrical apparatus?" The youth shifted nervously under Holmes's penetrating gaze, his eyes darting toward his employer before answering. "Sometimes, sir, when Mr. Venn requires assistance with the heavier equipment, but always during daylight hours, sir, and never alone." "Most commendable," Holmes replied, though his tone suggested he had learned something of considerable significance from this brief exchange. Lestrade, who had been following these proceedings with growing interest, now stepped forward with official authority. "Mr. Venn, I must ask you to account for your whereabouts last evening, between the hours of 10 and 1 o'clock. "Certainly, Inspector," Venn replied with renewed confidence. "I attended a demonstration of electrical phenomena at the Royal Institution, after which I took supper with 2 colleagues, Mr. Abel Fisk of Gray's Inn and Mr. Mortimer Vale, who manufactures scientific apparatus in Holborn. We discussed various matters of mutual professional interest until nearly midnight." Holmes's eyes sharpened with interest at the mention of Vale's name. "Mr. Mortimer Vale? A man whose reputation in electrical matters is considerable, I believe." "Indeed," Venn agreed. "He has been most helpful in providing me with the latest apparatus for my authentication work, a gentleman of remarkable technical knowledge and scientific curiosity." As we prepared to take our leave, Holmes paused at the shop's entrance and fixed Venn with that penetrating stare I had seen reduce stronger men to nervous confession. "Mr. Venn, I trust you will remain available should we require further assistance with our investigation?" "Naturally, Mr. Holmes," Venn replied, though his voice carried an undertone of barely suppressed anxiety. "I am always at the service of justice and proper inquiry." Once we had regained the fog-shrouded street, Holmes maintained thoughtful silence until we were well clear of the shop's vicinity. Finally he turned to us with that expression of quiet satisfaction that indicated significant progress in his reasoning. "A most illuminating interview," he observed. "We have discovered not only the source of our electrical components and the means by which they were transported to Marchmont Street, but also the existence of a third party whose technical expertise may prove central to our investigation." "You mean this Mortimer Vale?" I inquired. "Precisely, Watson. A man who manufactures the very apparatus used in our crime, who maintains professional relationships with our primary suspect, and who possesses the technical knowledge necessary to design such an ingenious mechanism. Moreover, young Bixby's boots place him at the scene, yet his obvious nervousness suggests he was merely a tool in more experienced hands. Lestrade looked puzzled. But surely Venn himself remains our primary suspect? The evidence against him seems overwhelming. Holmes smiled enigmatically as our hansom approached through the swirling fog. On the contrary, Inspector, I believe we are dealing with a conspiracy of considerably greater sophistication than a simple antiquarian's greed. The true architect of this crime possesses not only the technical knowledge to design such a mechanism, but also the strategic intelligence to ensure that suspicion falls upon others while he remains safely in the shadows. As we settled into the hansom for our return journey, Holmes leaned forward with renewed purpose. "I believe, gentlemen, that it is time we paid a visit to Mr. Mortimer Vale. Unless I am much mistaken, we shall find that our manufacturer of scientific apparatus has been conducting experiments of a most sinister nature." The journey to Holborn carried us through streets where the afternoon fog had begun to lift, revealing glimpses of the bustling commercial district that housed London's most progressive scientific establishments. Holmes remained wrapped in contemplation throughout the ride, his keen eyes occasionally catching details that escaped our notice, while his fingers drummed silently against his knee in that characteristic rhythm I had learned to associate with complex deductions taking shape in his remarkable mind. The premises of Mortimer Vale occupied an impressive corner building whose tall windows displayed an array of gleaming brass instruments and sophisticated electrical apparatus that spoke to a thriving enterprise in the rapidly expanding field of scientific manufacture. Unlike Venn's cluttered antiquarian shop, this establishment projected an air of modern efficiency and commercial success, its orderly displays suggesting both technical expertise and considerable financial resources. Holmes paused before the entrance, his attention caught by the various placards that advertised Vale's specialties in galvanic apparatus, electromagnetic devices, and precision instruments. Most significantly, a smaller sign near the door announced "Consultations in Applied Electrical Science," indicating that Vale's expertise extended beyond mere manufacture into the realm of custom design and specialized application. We were received by Vale himself, a robust gentleman of perhaps 50 years, whose intelligent features and confident bearing marked him as a man accustomed to dealing with clients of considerable importance. His hands, I noted with professional interest, were those of a craftsman familiar with delicate work, yet they bore none of the chemical stains or burn marks that had characterized Venn's fingers. His boots, of excellent quality, showed no trace of the distinctive clay we had encountered at both previous locations. "Gentlemen," Vale greeted us with polished courtesy, "I understand you are investigating the unfortunate death of Mr. Bartholomew Quinton, a most distressing business, though I confess I fail to see how my establishment might assist in such matters." Holmes settled into the offered chair with apparent casualness, though I recognized the deceptive relaxation that preceded his most penetrating inquiries. "Your reputation in electrical matters is considerable, Mr. Vale, and we have reason to believe that the circumstances of Mr. Quinton's death involve the application of advanced galvanic principles." "Indeed?" Vale's eyebrows rose with what appeared to be genuine interest. "I was under the impression that the gentleman had suffered a natural seizure of the heart." As this exchange continued, Holmes began his characteristic examination of the premises, his attention apparently caught by a workbench where various electrical components lay in organized array. Among these, his sharp eyes detected a small tin of dark, viscous wax, identical to that we had discovered in both Quinton's cellar and Venn's shop. Near it sat coils of the same hair-thin copper wire, we had found threaded through the library skirting. "You employ this wax in your work?" Holmes inquired with studied casualness. "Certainly," Vale replied without hesitation. "It serves admirably for sealing joints and insulating connections in damp environments. Many clients require apparatus capable of functioning in cellars and basements where moisture might compromise ordinary materials." Holmes nodded thoughtfully, then moved to examine a collection of electromagnets displayed upon a nearby shelf. Lifting one of the smaller devices, he studied its construction with the eye of a connoisseur. Exceptional workmanship. This particular design would be capable of exerting considerable attractive force despite its compact dimensions. "Thank you for the compliment," Vale replied with evident pride. "That model represents several years of refinement in both materials and construction techniques. Wire very similar to specimens we discovered at our crime scene," Holmes observed, producing the fragment he had collected. "Would you be able to identify the manufacturer of such material?" Vale examined the copper strand with professional interest, testing its flexibility between his fingers. "This is indeed of exceptional quality, though several London manufacturers produce wire of similar specification." As Holmes continued his methodical examination, his attention was drawn to a walking stick resting against a workbench. Taking it up with apparent negligence, he studied the silver ferrule with his magnifying glass. I observed him register something of significance, though his expression remained unchanged as he carefully replaced the stick. "Mr. Vale," Holmes said finally, "you dined with Mr. Venn last evening, I believe?" "Indeed, along with Mr. Abel Fisk of Gray's Inn. We discussed various matters of mutual professional interest, including theoretical questions regarding the transmission of electrical current through building structures." Holmes's eyes sharpened at this revelation. "A most timely topic of conversation, given recent events." "Entirely theoretical," Vale replied, though his voice carried an undertone of defensiveness. "We were considering applications for domestic lighting in older buildings where concealment of wiring presents significant challenges." Once we had regained the street, Holmes maintained thoughtful silence until we were well clear of Vale's establishment. Finally, he turned to us with that expression of grim satisfaction that indicated significant progress in his reasoning. "We are dealing with a conspiracy of remarkable sophistication," he announced. "Vale possesses the technical knowledge, Venn provides the antiquarian expertise, while young Bixby serves as the instrument for physical installation. Yet I suspect the true architect of this scheme possesses motivations far more complex than mere commercial greed." As our hansom approached through the thinning fog, Holmes leaned forward with renewed purpose. "Inspector Lestrade, I believe it is time we examined Mr. Abel Fisk's role in this affair. Unless I am much mistaken, we shall find that our barrister friend has been orchestrating events from a position of considerable legal advantage." The journey to Gray's Inn carried us through streets where the afternoon fog had begun to lift, revealing the austere Georgian facades of those ancient legal precincts where the law had been practiced for centuries. Holmes remained wrapped in contemplation throughout the ride, his keen eyes occasionally catching details that escaped our notice, while his fingers drummed silently against his knee, in that characteristic rhythm I had learned to associate with complex deductions taking shape in his remarkable mind. The chambers of Mr. Abel Fisk occupied a position of considerable prestige within the inn, their tall windows overlooking the plane trees of the historic square where barristers had walked and debated for generations. We were received by a nervous clerk whose manner suggested that visits from Scotland Yard were not entirely welcome in these dignified surroundings, though he ushered us with professional courtesy into chambers that spoke eloquently of both success and scholarly refinement. Mr. Abel Fisk proved to be a gentleman of perhaps 45 years, his lean frame clothed in the sober black of his profession, while his intelligent features bore that particular pallor of one who spent long hours bent over legal documents. His manner was that of a man accustomed to dealing with delicate matters requiring both discretion and precision. Yet I detected an underlying tension in the slight tremor of his right hand and the tightness around his mouth that suggested our arrival had not been entirely unexpected. "Gentlemen," Fisk greeted us with professional courtesy, though his eyes held a wariness that did not escape Holmes's notice. "I understand you are investigating the unfortunate death of Mr. Bartholomew Quinton. A most distressing business, though I confess I cannot imagine how my chambers might assist in such matters." Holmes settled into the offered chair with that deceptive casualness I had learned to recognize as the prelude to his most penetrating inquiries. His keen eyes swept the room with apparent appreciation for its scholarly appointments, taking in the law books that lined the walls from floor to ceiling and the several pieces of medieval metalwork displayed upon side tables that indicated their owner's appreciation for historical artifacts. "Your practice specializes in probate and estate matters, I believe," Holmes observed with studied interest. "Such work must occasionally bring you into contact with collectors of valuable antiquities and their testamentary arrangements." "Indeed," Fisk replied with growing confidence, "the proper disposition of collections requires considerable expertise in authentication and valuation. I have developed relationships with various specialists in the field, including Mr. Silas Venn, whose scholarly knowledge has proven invaluable in several complex cases." As this exchange continued, Holmes had begun his characteristic examination of the chamber's contents, his attention apparently caught by a rolled plan secured with green tape upon a side table. Without asking leave, he unfastened it and spread it upon the desk with a firmness that would have been offensive from any other man. It proved to be a detailed survey of the Marchmont Street house and its immediate surroundings, complete with measurements not only of the rooms, but of joists and cellar spans, such as I had seen in architects' drawings. "A curious document for routine legal work," Holmes remarked, studying the precise measurements and structural details. "These specifications have the character of a survey for renovation or modification, rather than simple property conveyance." Fisk's composure wavered almost imperceptibly at this observation. "Mr. Quinton contemplated modern electrical lighting some months past," he inquired, "as to the legality of concealing wires within the fabric of a listed structure. I procured the survey for his consideration, though the project ultimately went no further." "Yet you retained the plan," Holmes murmured, his eyes noting every detail of the structural measurements. Near the desk, his attention was drawn to a walking stick that rested against the barrister's chair, its silver ferrule bearing a distinctive pattern of scratches that matched exactly those he had observed on Vale's walking stick earlier that day. "You dined with Mr. Venn and Mr. Vale last evening," Holmes continued with apparent casualness, "a gathering of gentlemen with remarkably complementary expertise in matters both legal and technical." "A purely social occasion," Fisk protested, though his voice lacked conviction. "We discussed various matters of mutual professional interest, including theoretical questions regarding the integration of modern conveniences into older buildings." Holmes lifted the walking stick with the delicate touch of a connoisseur, examining the scratched ferrule with his magnifying glass. "This has seen service in rather specialized environments recently, cellars and basements perhaps, where the authentication of concealed artifacts might require physical investigation." "Historical research occasionally demands such work," Fisk admitted with obvious reluctance, his eyes following Holmes's examination of the stick. "Many valuable pieces were deliberately hidden during periods of religious persecution." As Holmes continued his methodical inspection, his sharp eyes detected a small fleck of dark, viscous wax clinging to the edge of Fisk's blotting pad, the same substance we had encountered at both previous locations. More significantly, the carriage clock upon the mantelpiece showed a time several minutes slow, suggesting its owner had been absent during the crucial hours when regular winding would have occurred. "Mr. Fisk," Holmes said finally, fixing the barrister with that penetrating stare that had reduced stronger men to nervous confession, "I believe you are intimately familiar with the terms of Mr. Quinton's will." The question struck its target with devastating accuracy. Fisk's carefully maintained professional composure cracked visibly, and for a moment his mask slipped to reveal the anxiety beneath. "Such matters are protected by legal privilege, Mr. Holmes. I cannot discuss confidential client arrangements without proper authority." "The privilege dies with the client when murder is suspected," Holmes replied with quiet intensity. "Moreover, I believe we shall discover that your interest in Mr. Quinton's affairs extended far beyond professional duty into the realm of personal financial advantage. The timing of his death was no coincidence, but carefully calculated to coincide with specific provisions that would benefit certain parties only if his demise appeared natural." Lestrade stepped forward with official authority. "Mr. Fisk, I must ask you to account for your whereabouts last evening, during the crucial hours between 10 o'clock and midnight." "I have already provided a complete account," Fisk replied, though his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "I attended the Royal Institution with my colleagues, after which we took supper together. I returned here shortly after midnight, as the porter can confirm." Holmes smiled with grim satisfaction as he indicated the slow clock. "Your timepiece suggests otherwise, Mr. Fisk. A man of precise habits does not allow his clock to run slow unless his routine has been severely disrupted. I suspect you returned considerably later than midnight, after ensuring that your mechanical contrivance had served its deadly purpose." As we prepared to take our leave, Holmes fixed the barrister with a final, penetrating look. "Mr. Fisk, you have orchestrated a conspiracy of remarkable sophistication, combining technical expertise, antiquarian knowledge, and legal manipulation to achieve your ends. When we return tomorrow with proper warrants, I trust you will be prepared to discuss your role as the architect of Mr. Quinton's murder with complete honesty." Once we had regained the fog-shrouded street, Holmes maintained thoughtful silence until we were well clear of Gray's Inn. Finally, he turned to us with an expression of grim determination that indicated the case was approaching its climax. "We have discovered not only the means and opportunity for murder," he announced, "but also the financial motive that drove these men to such desperate measures. Fisk possesses the legal knowledge to manipulate estate provisions, Vale provides the technical expertise, Venn supplies the antiquarian cover, while young Bixby serves as their unwitting instrument. Mr. Quinton's death was carefully timed to prevent changes to his will that would have thwarted their scheme entirely." "But what scheme, Holmes?" I pressed. "What could justify such elaborate preparation and risk?" "That, my dear Watson, will become clear when we examine the true terms of Mr. Quinton's testament," Holmes replied with quiet confidence. "I suspect we shall find that our conspirators stood to gain far more than a single medieval bell from the old gentleman's carefully orchestrated demise." The return journey to Baker Street found Holmes in that state of restless intellectual ferment that I had learned to recognize as the prelude to his most penetrating insights. The fog had begun to lift with the approach of evening, revealing gaslit streets where the familiar sounds of London commerce provided a stark contrast to the sinister conspiracy we had been unravelling throughout the day. As our hansom rolled through the familiar thoroughfares, Holmes suddenly leaned forward, with that expression of dawning comprehension that marked the moment when scattered evidence crystallized into coherent understanding. "Watson," he declared with quiet urgency, We have been approaching this matter from entirely the wrong direction. The bell, the electrical apparatus, even the murder itself, are merely instruments in a far more sophisticated scheme. The true crime lies not in what was taken, but in what was prevented from being given. Upon reaching our lodgings, Holmes immediately dispatched a flurry of telegrams with that characteristic energy that seized him when the solution to a complex problem began to emerge. One went to the Royal Institution requesting confirmation of the previous evening's demonstration schedule, another to the porter at Gray's Inn inquiring as to the precise time of Mr. Fisk's return, a third to Somerset House regarding the registration of recent trusts and charitable foundations, and a fourth to Mr. Quinton's solicitor, requesting urgent clarification regarding any pending modifications to his client's testament. While we awaited replies, Holmes paced before the fire with the nervous precision of a caged panther, his keen mind working through the implications of our day's discoveries. "Consider the elaborate nature of the mechanism we uncovered," he said, his voice carrying that note of professional admiration he reserved for particularly ingenious criminal enterprises. Such sophistication suggests planning that extends far beyond simple theft or even conventional murder for gain. The answers arrived within the hour, brought up by Mrs. Hudson with her accustomed discretion. Holmes tore them open in rapid succession, his grey eyes scanning each response with growing satisfaction. The Royal Institution demonstration had concluded at 9:30, with the subsequent supper ending shortly after 11. The porter at Gray's Inn reported Mr. Fisk's return at 20 minutes before 2 in the morning, considerably later than the barrister had claimed. Most significantly, the solicitor's reply confirmed that Mr. Quinton had indeed intended to execute a new codicil the following morning, one that would fundamentally alter the disposition of his estate. "The final piece of our puzzle, Watson," Holmes announced, passing me the solicitor's telegram. "Mr. Quinton's existing will, drafted some years ago by Abel Fisk himself, contains a most peculiar provision. Should the testator die of natural causes within 3 months of acquiring any artifact believed to possess supernatural properties, the bulk of his estate would pass not to Miss Quinton, but to a trust established for the advancement of scientific inquiry into paranormal phenomena." The implications struck me with chilling clarity. And the trustees of this organization? "None other than Messrs. Venn and Vale, with Fisk as legal administrator," Holmes replied with grim satisfaction. The Carmelite bell was not merely the object of their desire, but the very instrument that would trigger this extraordinary bequest. They needed Mr. Quinton to acquire a cursed artifact and then die of apparently natural causes within the specified time frame. The audacity of the scheme was breathtaking in its complexity. The electrical apparatus had been designed not merely to kill, but to create the precise conditions required by the will's unusual codicil. The supernatural manifestation served multiple purposes, lending credence to the bell's supposed mystical properties, inducing cardiac stress that would make the death appear more convincingly natural, and providing psychological cover for the moment of electrical discharge. "But Holmes," I pressed, "surely such an elaborate provision would raise suspicions in any court." "On the contrary, my dear fellow," he replied, moving to the window, where the evening fog swirled in eddying patterns. "Fisk is a barrister of considerable reputation, and the will was executed years before any of these men came into significant contact with Mr. Quinton. Moreover, the testator's known fascination with supernatural phenomena would make such a codicil appear merely eccentric rather than suspicious. It is a masterpiece of legal manipulation designed to appear as the whim of a scholarly antiquarian rather than the foundation of an elaborate murder plot." Holmes suddenly seized his coat with characteristic decision. "Come, Watson, I believe Miss Quinton is in far greater danger than we had previously supposed. The new codicil Mr. Quinton intended to execute would have voided the supernatural provision entirely, making her the sole beneficiary of his estate. With his death, she becomes the only obstacle to their scheme's success. We found Marchmont Street shrouded once more in evening fog, the Georgian terrace assuming that air of Gothic mystery that London's older districts wore like a familiar garment. Miss Quinton received us in the library where her uncle had died, her composure admirable, despite the obvious strain of the day's revelations. The room had been restored to order, yet the atmosphere remained heavy with recent tragedy. "Miss Quinton," Holmes began without preamble, "I must ask you about your uncle's testamentary arrangements. Had he recently expressed any intention of modifying his will?" Her face grew thoughtful as she considered the implications of his inquiry. Indeed, he had spoken of substantial changes just last week. He wished to establish a trust that would preserve his entire collection for scholarly study, with myself as principal beneficiary and trustee. The arrangement would have prevented any individual items from being sold, regardless of their value. "And when was this new will to have been executed?" "This very morning, Mr. Holmes. He had an appointment with his solicitor at 10 o'clock. The papers required only his signature to become legally binding." Holmes moved to the mantelpiece where the bronze bell sat among other antiquarian objects, lifting it with the reverent touch of one handling evidence of supreme importance. As he examined its ancient surface in the lamplight, a sound arose that sent a chill along my spine. The thin, uncanny bell tone we had heard described, muted yet clear, seeming to emanate from the very boards beneath our feet. Holmes was in motion before the last vibration died. "Watson, to the cellar! Miss Quinton, remain here and admit no one!" We clattered down the wooden steps, my lantern sending grotesque shadows across the whitewashed walls. Holmes went directly to the concealed cavity, kneeling to examine the electrical apparatus with urgent precision. "Warm," he said softly, his palm against the brick. "The battery has been engaged within the quarter hour." The zinc terminals showed bright where contact had been recently made, while the chemical paste still gleamed with fresh moisture. A faint sound near the area door arrested his attention, and he sprang toward the entrance just as a dark figure slipped through the opening and fled into the fog-laden garden. We gained the small rear garden in time to see a shadow vault the low wall with athletic ease. Holmes halted, listening intently as the sound of rapid footsteps receded into the night. "Too late, Watson," he breathed, though not without admiration for the fugitive's agility. "But not before he has paid a toll." He stooped at the wall's coping and lifted a small prize between finger and thumb, a shred of fine black cloth bearing a thread of green silk. In the soft earth below lay a clear heel impression, machine-pegged, with the distinctive nick we had observed before, though notably larger than young Bixby's boot. "Someone of education wore another man's boots tonight," Holmes observed with quiet satisfaction. "That is a refinement I have learned to recognize in crimes of unusual sophistication." Back in the library, Holmes moved with peculiar, erratic energy, examining the bell with his magnifying glass, measuring distances from mantel to skirting, then suddenly mounting a chair to sight along the cornice with the precision of a surveyor. Near the hearth, he pointed to minute smears upon the stone. "Beeswax and graphite, Watson. The clapper was weighted to ensure proper tone, then restored to its original condition." Our friend rehearsed his manifestation thoroughly before attempting his greater mischief. He indicated charred fragments near the writing desk where faint traces of blue paper ash remained. The codicil that would have thwarted their scheme was destroyed here within the hour, the bell providing distraction while documents were burned. Holmes placed the recovered cloth fragment beside the bell and regarded both with the intensity of a chess master contemplating a critical position. 3 men and a bell, Watson, but only one architect possessed of sufficient legal knowledge to design such an elaborate testamentary trap. Tomorrow we shall give Mr. Fisk and his confederates an opportunity to claim their prize, and in doing so provide us with the final evidence necessary for their conviction. He moved to the writing desk and withdrew paper and pen with decisive purpose. Miss Quinton, you will oblige me by sending notes to Messrs. Venn, Vale, and Fisk, requesting their presence here tomorrow at noon for the reading of your uncle's will. Add that you have discovered certain documents that may affect the disposition of his collection, and that the Carmelite bell will be returned to its rightful owner upon proper legal advice. Miss Quinton looked startled, but nodded with admirable resolve. If you believe it necessary, Mr. Holmes. Essential, he replied with that quiet confidence I had learned to respect. We shall provide our conspirators with their stage and their audience, and we shall surround the performance with evidence so fine they will not perceive the trap until the final curtain falls. Watson, bring your service revolver tomorrow. This is a drama in which desperate men may attempt a sudden exit before justice can be served. As we prepared to leave, Holmes paused at the library door and surveyed the scene with the satisfaction of a general who has positioned his forces for decisive battle. The bell that rang beneath the floor has tolled not for the dead, but for the living, he observed with quiet intensity. Tomorrow it shall ring once more, but this time to summon justice rather than to mask murder. The following morning found us once more in Baker Street well before dawn, with Holmes wrapped in that state of restless preparation I had learned to associate with the approach of his most elaborate stratagems. He had risen early to dispatch final telegrams and receive confirmations. His correspondence spread across our breakfast table like the battle plans of a general preparing for decisive engagement. The fog had lifted with the night, revealing one of those crisp October mornings that transform London's familiar streets into something approaching clarity. Watson, he declared with suppressed excitement, today we shall provide our conspirators with exactly the stage they require for their final performance, while ensuring that every word and gesture serves as evidence for their conviction. Over breakfast he outlined his preparations with characteristic precision. Inspector Lestrade would position himself in the garden with 2 constables, while additional officers would secure both ends of Marchmont Street. Most significantly, Holmes had spent the early hours modifying the electrical apparatus in Quinton's cellar, installing a sensitive galvanometer that would detect any attempt to activate the mechanism while allowing him to control its operation from above. By 11:30, we had arrived at Marchmont Street, where Miss Quinton awaited us with admirable composure despite the strain of recent events. Holmes immediately set about his final preparations with that meticulous attention to detail that had served him so well in previous cases. He dusted the inner edge of the skirting near the concealed aperture with a fine, dark powder that would cling to any hand that touched it. A thin slip of paper, secretly marked, was placed beneath the blotter upon the writing desk, while in the cellar he interposed a fragment of card between 2 terminals so that no current could pass except at his choosing. Finally, he arranged the bronze bell upon the mantelpiece with the faintest deviation from its former position, a displacement so slight that only his trained eye could detect it. "You will observe from your position by the door, Watson," he instructed as the appointed hour approached. "Miss Quinton will receive our visitors with the news that certain documents have been discovered which may alter the estate's disposition. At no point should anyone approach the writing desk until I give the signal." Our visitors arrived with punctual precision that spoke to their shared anxiety. Silas Venn came first, his scholarly features carefully composed, though his eyes immediately sought the bell with barely concealed longing. Mortimer Vale followed within minutes, his robust frame clothed in appropriate morning attire, yet his intelligent gaze surveyed the room with the calculating assessment of a man evaluating commercial possibilities. Abel Fisk entered last, his professional bearing somewhat strained by obvious tension, the leather portfolio in his hand presumably containing the relevant testamentary documents. "Gentlemen," Miss Quinton began with practised composure, "I have discovered certain papers among my uncle's effects that may require legal interpretation. The disposition of his collection, particularly items of supposed supernatural significance, appears more complex than originally understood." The effect of her words was immediate and profound. Venn stepped forward with barely restrained eagerness, while Vale's commercial instincts engaged visibly. Fisk, however, showed the most pronounced reaction, his legal training allowing him to recognize that the carefully arranged papers near the fireplace were not the documents he expected to find destroyed. It was at this crucial moment that Holmes, through his concealed mechanism, caused the thin, uncanny bell tone to arise from beneath our feet. The sound fell upon the library like drops in a still pool, exactly as the household had described on the night of Quinton's death. Venn stepped back with visible alarm, his scholarly composure cracking to reveal the anxiety beneath. Vale's jaw tightened, his head turning not to the mantelpiece where the bell sat, but to that inconspicuous section of skirting which Holmes had prepared. Fisk alone maintained professional control, though his face had grown noticeably pale. "Curious harmonics in old timber," Holmes observed with studied casualness, emerging from his position near the door. "Perhaps Mr. Vale, with his technical expertise, might examine the source of such phenomena." The suggestion struck its target with devastating accuracy. Vale, compelled by a combination of professional pride and desperate necessity, moved toward the skirting with the precision of a man following a familiar path. His hand darted to the junction of wood and floor, fingers searching for the concealed mechanism with betraying familiarity. In that instant, Holmes's arm flashed forward, grasping Vale's wrist, just as the engineer's fingertips contacted the dusted surface. "Gently, Mr. Vale," Holmes said with quiet authority. "You are not in your workshop now." When Holmes released him, Vale's fingertips bore the unmistakable black film that marked his contact with the prepared evidence. He stared at the betraying stains with a scientist's dismay at the inevitable, then cast a desperate glance toward Fisk, whose professional mask had not altered by a single line. "Inspector Lestrade," Holmes called softly, and the library door opened to admit the waiting officers. "I believe we have sufficient evidence to proceed with the arrests we discussed." Venn uttered a strangled protest, backing away from the bell as though it might accuse him directly. Vale's shoulders bunched with the tension of a man contemplating desperate action, but the sight of my service revolver, now clearly visible, discouraged any thoughts of violence. Fisk maintained his barrister's composure with remarkable determination, though the slight tremor in his hands betrayed his inner turmoil. "For what crime do you arrest us?" Vale demanded hoarsely. "Examining a skirting board constitutes no felony. Tampering with evidence after the fact of murder constitutes rather more than curiosity," Holmes replied with grim satisfaction. "Your hands, sir, have betrayed you twice over. The powder marks your guilt as surely as the green silk thread we recovered marks your presence in this house during the crucial hours." As Lestrade's men moved to secure the prisoners, Holmes stooped to collect a final piece of evidence from the carpet where it had fallen unnoticed. "Add this to your exhibits, Inspector," he said, holding up a tiny fragment of black cloth bearing the distinctive green silk lining. "It may serve to connect last night's desperate visit with this morning's equally desperate attempt at concealment." The trap had been sprung with perfect precision, and our conspirators found themselves ensnared by evidence of their own making. The bell that had rung beneath the floor would ring no more, but its final performance had summoned justice at last. As the constables led our three prisoners from the library, Holmes remained motionless beside the writing desk, his keen eyes fixed upon the bronze bell with an intensity that suggested his investigation was far from complete. The silence that followed their departure seemed to press against the walls of the room, heavy with the weight of revelations that had transformed a scholarly sanctuary into the scene of an elaborate murder. Miss Quinton, though visibly shaken by the morning's events, maintained her admirable composure as she settled into a chair beside the fire, her gaze moving between Holmes and myself with a mixture of gratitude and lingering bewilderment. "The mechanism itself tells only part of our story," Holmes observed, kneeling once more beside the concealed aperture in the skirting. With delicate precision, he began to extract the remaining components of the electrical apparatus, laying each piece upon a clean cloth with the care of a surgeon arranging his instruments. "Watson, observe how the copper wire has been threaded through this channel with mathematical precision. The angle of approach, the careful insulation at each junction, the positioning of the electromagnet to achieve maximum attractive force upon the bell's bronze composition." I examined the apparatus with growing appreciation for its sophistication. The electromagnet was indeed a masterpiece of compact design, its coils wound with the precision that spoke to Vail's considerable expertise. The galvanic cell, though small, was of the most advanced type, capable of delivering substantial current when properly activated. Most significantly, the entire mechanism had been designed for remote operation, allowing the conspirators to trigger their supernatural manifestation from a safe distance. "But Holmes," I pressed, "how did you deduce the existence of the testamentary provision that made this elaborate scheme profitable? Surely such specific legal knowledge suggests inside information of the most detailed variety." Holmes rose from his examination and moved to the writing desk, where he lifted the leather blotter to reveal several items he had concealed there during our morning preparations. Among them was a fragment of blue legal paper, partially burned, but bearing enough text to reveal its significance. "The codicil that Mr. Quinton intended to execute yesterday morning," he explained, "was not entirely destroyed in last night's hasty conflagration. This remnant, preserved beneath the blotter where the flames could not reach, contains sufficient text to confirm the old gentleman's intentions." Miss Quinton leaned forward with evident interest as Holmes carefully unfolded the charred fragment. Though damaged, the document clearly showed provisions establishing a trust for the preservation of the entire collection, with Miss Quinton as principal beneficiary and trustee. More significantly, it contained specific language voiding any previous testamentary provisions relating to supernatural or paranormal phenomena, thereby eliminating the very clause upon which the conspirators' scheme depended. "Your uncle was a man of considerable foresight," Holmes continued, addressing Miss Quinton directly. "His correspondence with his solicitor, which we shall no doubt discover in due course, will show that he had grown suspicious of the unusual interest in his collection, particularly after Mr. Venn's increasingly aggressive attempts to purchase the Carmelite bell. The new codicil was his attempt to protect both you and his life's work from those who saw only commercial value in objects of genuine historical significance." As Holmes spoke, his attention was drawn to a small leather portfolio that had fallen behind the writing desk during the morning's confrontation. Retrieving it, with characteristic thoroughness, he found it to contain several documents that shed additional light upon the conspiracy's scope and sophistication. Among them was a detailed survey of the house's structural elements, annotated in Fiske's precise legal hand, with measurements and calculations that left no doubt as to the premeditated nature of their scheme. "The planning extended far beyond the immediate crime," Holmes observed. studying the annotated plans. These calculations show the precise positioning required for the electromagnet to achieve maximum effect upon the bell, the optimal placement of the galvanic cell to ensure reliable operation, and even contingency arrangements should the initial attempt prove unsuccessful. This was not the work of opportunistic criminals, but of men who approached murder with the methodical precision of a scientific experiment. The portfolio also contained correspondence between the three conspirators that revealed the true extent of their collaboration. Venn's letters detailed his research into Mr. Quinton's collecting habits and medical history, while Vale's technical specifications showed the exact requirements for the electrical apparatus. Most damning of all were Fisk's legal memoranda, which outlined the testamentary provisions with clinical precision and calculated the probable timeline for their scheme's execution. The supernatural codicil in the original will, Holmes explained, was Fisk's masterpiece of legal manipulation. Drafted years ago when he first became Mr. Quinton's legal advisor, it appeared to be merely the eccentric whim of a scholarly collector. In reality, it was a trap waiting to be sprung, requiring only the acquisition of a suitable artifact and the orchestration of an apparently natural death within the specified time frame. Miss Quinton's face had grown pale as the full implications became clear. Then my uncle's death was planned from the very beginning of their association? Not immediately, Holmes replied with gentle precision. The original codicil created the opportunity, but the specific timing was determined by more recent events. Your uncle's decision to modify his will, combined with his refusal to sell the Carmelite bell, created the urgency that drove them to action. They needed him to die before the new codicil could be executed, while ensuring that his death appeared to result from the supernatural properties of his recent acquisition. Holmes moved to the mantelpiece and lifted the bronze bell one final time, turning it slowly in the afternoon light that filtered through the library windows. This ancient artifact, which had witnessed centuries of prayer and devotion, became the unwitting instrument of a murder that combined medieval superstition with modern scientific knowledge. The irony is profound, Watson. Men who possessed the technical skill to harness electricity for beneficial purposes instead chose to employ it in service of greed and deception. As we prepared to conclude our investigation of the immediate scene, Holmes paused beside the concealed mechanism and made one final adjustment to its positioning. "Inspector Lestrade will require this apparatus as evidence," he observed, "but I suspect our conspirators have not yet exhausted their capacity for mischief. Fisk, in particular, possesses both the legal knowledge and the desperation necessary for one final attempt to salvage his scheme." The afternoon sun had begun to slant through the library windows, casting long shadows across the room, where so much deception had been practiced and finally exposed. Holmes gathered the various pieces of evidence with methodical care, ensuring that each fragment of the conspiracy would be available for the legal proceedings that must inevitably follow. Yet something in his manner suggested that our investigation was approaching its climax rather than its conclusion. "Watson," he said finally, "I believe we should return to Baker Street to await developments. Unless I am much mistaken, the next 24 hours will see one final act in this drama, as our remaining conspirator makes his inevitable attempt to escape the consequences of his carefully orchestrated crime. When that moment comes, we must be prepared to provide the final proof that will ensure justice for Mr. Quinton and security for Miss Quinton's rightful inheritance." As we took our leave of Marchmont Street, Holmes cast one last glance at the library, where the bronze bell sat silent upon its mantelpiece. No longer would it serve as an instrument of supernatural deception, but would take its proper place among the scholarly treasures that Mr. Quinton had spent his lifetime preserving for future generations. The bell that had rung beneath the floor had finally ceased its ominous tolling, yet Holmes's expression suggested that its final performance was yet to come. The following morning brought news that justified Holmes's darkest apprehensions. Inspector Lestrade arrived at Baker Street with the grim intelligence that Abel Fisk had somehow secured his release on bail, his professional standing and connections having provided the influence necessary to gain temporary freedom, despite the serious nature of the charges against him. Venn and Vale remained securely lodged in the cells at Bow Street, but the architect of their conspiracy had slipped through the initial net of justice. A barrister of his caliber will not waste such an opportunity, Holmes observed, with characteristic prescience, his keen eyes taking on that distant look I had learned to associate with complex strategic calculations. He understands that while the evidence against his confederates is substantial, his own direct participation in the murder itself remains circumstantial. More significantly, he knows that possession of the Carmelite bell might still validate his claim to the supernatural bequest, particularly if he can cast doubt upon the legitimacy of our investigation. Holmes moved to his desk and began composing a series of urgent telegrams with the focused intensity that marked his most critical communications. The timing constraints of the original codicil work both for and against him, Watson. Mr. Quinton acquired the bell exactly 11 weeks ago, leaving our conspirators with only 1 week in which to accomplish their murderous scheme. That same urgency now drives Fisk to desperate measures, for he knows that delay will only strengthen the case against him. The afternoon brought a succession of disturbing reports that confirmed Holmes's expectations. Fisk had failed to appear at his chambers, while his clerk reported the hasty destruction of several legal documents in the office fireplace. More ominously, inquiries at coaching inns revealed that a gentleman matching the barrister's description had made urgent inquiries regarding passage to Dover, though no actual booking had been secured. "Flight suggests guilt," Holmes murmured, "yet I suspect our learned friend has one final gambit to attempt before abandoning his scheme entirely. The legal mind trained in manipulation does not surrender its advantages without exhausting every possible stratagem." As evening approached, Holmes suddenly seized his coat with characteristic decision. "Come, Watson, I believe Mr. Fisk will return to Marchmont Street tonight for one final attempt at securing his prize. The bell that served as the instrument of his conspiracy may yet prove to be the means of his ultimate capture." We found Miss Quinton prepared for our arrival, her admirable composure intact despite the strain of recent revelations. At Holmes's direction, she withdrew to the safety of a neighbour's house, leaving the library dark and apparently unguarded. Holmes immediately set about his preparations with methodical precision, modifying the concealed electrical apparatus so that any attempt to activate it would register upon a sensitive needle he had positioned near the mantelpiece. "When our friend completes the circuit," he explained in low tones, "this instrument will provide immediate warning of his presence. More significantly, I have prepared the scene exactly as it was on the night of the murder, complete with fresh powder upon the skirting and a thin coating of conductive paste upon the brass edge of the writing desk. We positioned ourselves in the darkened library as the fog of evening gathered outside the tall windows, transforming the familiar Georgian street into something approaching Gothic mystery. Holmes had arranged for Lestrade and his men to maintain watch from the garden and mews, while we waited within for the desperate man who must inevitably return to claim what he believed to be rightfully his. Near midnight, the faint scrape of metal upon metal announced the arrival we had anticipated. A dark figure rose from the area steps with the confident movements of one following a rehearsed plan, fitting a duplicate key to the kitchen door with practiced ease. He moved through the house with cat-like stealth, pausing in the library doorway to survey the scene before approaching his objectives. Fisk went first to the bronze bell upon the mantelpiece, his hands trembling slightly as he lifted the ancient artifact that had served as both inspiration and instrument for his elaborate scheme. Setting it carefully aside, he moved to the writing desk where he placed several folded documents upon the blotter, legal papers that would presumably support whatever final deception he had prepared. It was then that he approached the concealed mechanism in the skirting, his movements betraying intimate familiarity with the electrical apparatus hidden within the walls. Holmes's finger hovered over the hidden switch as Fisk knelt beside the aperture, his left hand searching for the copper wire that would complete the deadly circuit. The bell spoke with that thin, uncanny tone we had heard described so often, 3 clear notes that seemed to rise from the very foundations of the house. Fisk started at the sound but quickly mastered himself, pressing his fingertips to the prepared surface of the skirting with desperate determination. The powder marked him instantly, dark stains upon his gloves that would provide irrefutable evidence of his presence at the scene. Holmes was upon him before he could react, while Lestrade burst through the library door with his constables close behind. Fisk made one desperate attempt to reach the window, but found it secured against escape by Holmes's earlier preparations. "The game is concluded, Mr. Fisk," Holmes declared with quiet authority, as my service revolver discouraged any further resistance. "Your hands bear the evidence of your guilt as surely as your conscience bears the weight of Mr. Quinton's murder." Upon Fisk's person, we discovered not only the duplicate keys that had provided his access to the house, but also a pair of misfitting boots wrapped in brown paper, the very footwear that had left its distinctive impressions in the cellar, borrowed to cast suspicion upon his unwitting accomplice. Most damning of all was his cloak, whose green silk lining matched perfectly the thread we had recovered from the garden wall. In the clear light of the following morning, Holmes provided his final explanation of the murder method to Inspector Lestrade and Miss Quinton, demonstrating how the electrical apparatus had been designed to kill while creating the illusion of supernatural manifestation. The bell's tones were indeed produced by the concealed electromagnet, he explained, but death came through a far more direct application of galvanic force. A fine copper wire, threaded beneath the leather blotter, connected to the brass rim of the writing desk, while damp clay upon the hearth rug provided the necessary ground for the electrical circuit. The fatal mechanism. When Mr. Quinton, alarmed by the mysterious bell ringing, instinctively gripped the edge of his desk for support, the electrical current passed directly through his body from hand to foot, causing the cardiac seizure that ended his life. The burns we had discovered upon the brass rim, combined with the sharp metallic odor that had lingered in the room, provided clear evidence of this electrical discharge. Vail designed the mechanism, Holmes concluded. Venn provided the antiquarian expertise to make the supernatural elements credible, while Fisk orchestrated the legal framework that would have made their conspiracy profitable. Each man contributed his particular skills to a scheme of remarkable sophistication, yet they failed to account for the one element that ultimately exposed them, the physical evidence that no amount of legal manipulation could erase. With their confessions secured and the evidence overwhelming, the supernatural trust established by the fraudulent codicil was dissolved, leaving Miss Quinton as the rightful inheritor of her uncle's estate and scholarly collection. The Carmelite bell, no longer an instrument of deception and death, took its proper place among the medieval artifacts that Mr. Quinton had spent his lifetime preserving for future generations. As we prepared to leave Marchmont Street for the final time, Holmes paused beside the bronze bell with an expression of profound reflection. Science, misused, becomes superstition, armed with copper wire, he observed quietly. These men possessed knowledge that might have benefited humanity, yet they chose to employ it in service of greed and murder. The bell that rang beneath the floor has finally ceased its ominous tolling, and justice has been served at last. The case of the bell that rang beneath the floor was closed, its mystery solved through the application of logical deduction to physical evidence, proving once again that no crime, however ingeniously conceived, can long withstand the penetrating analysis of a truly scientific mind. 3 weeks after the dramatic conclusion in Marchmont Street, I found Holmes in his familiar position before the fire at Baker Street, the morning papers scattered across our table bearing headlines that proclaimed the conviction of all 3 conspirators. The trial had proceeded with remarkable swiftness once the physical evidence was properly presented, each piece of Holmes's methodical investigation proving irrefutable under legal scrutiny. "The final sentences were pronounced yesterday," Holmes observed, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin in that attitude of philosophical reflection which often followed the successful resolution of a complex case. Fisk and Vale received the ultimate penalty, while Venn, whose confession proved instrumental in securing the convictions of his confederates, was sentenced to transportation. Young Bixby, as we anticipated, was released without charges, his role having been established as purely mechanical. The relief in Holmes's voice was evident when he spoke of the lad's fate. The boy had been guilty of nothing more than following orders without sufficient curiosity regarding their ultimate purpose, his borrowed boots and innocent assistance having made him an unwitting tool in a scheme whose true nature he never understood. Miss Quinton had called upon us the previous afternoon to express her gratitude and to report on the disposition of her uncle's collection. With the fraudulent codicil voided and her inheritance secured, she had dedicated herself to fulfilling her uncle's scholarly intentions. The entire collection would be properly catalogued and eventually donated to the British Museum, where its historical significance could be appreciated by future generations of researchers. The Carmelite bell has been restored to its place of honour in the library, she had informed us with evident satisfaction. No longer an instrument of deception and death, but a genuine relic of medieval devotion valued for its true historical importance rather than its supposed supernatural properties. Holmes rose from his chair and moved to the window where the familiar sights of Baker Street provided a reassuring contrast to the Gothic mysteries we had so recently unravelled. The case presented several features of unusual interest, Watson. The combination of ancient superstition with modern scientific knowledge, the exploitation of legal technicalities for criminal purposes, and most significantly, the demonstration that even the most ingenious deception must ultimately yield to systematic investigation based upon physical evidence. As he spoke, I reflected upon the deeper lessons embedded within the elaborate conspiracy we had unmasked. 3 men of considerable education and professional standing had chosen to employ their knowledge in service of greed and murder, demonstrating that intellectual capacity divorced from moral principle becomes merely a more sophisticated form of criminality. "It is a curious thing," Holmes continued, his voice carrying that note of melancholy which sometimes accompanied his greatest triumphs, "how the human intellect, capable of such sublime heights of creation, can also stoop to such calculated depths of malice. Vale's electrical expertise, Venn's scholarly research, and Fisk's legal acumen might have established a profitable and honourable partnership in the growing field of scientific authentication. Instead, they chose to weave a tapestry of deception so intricate that it might have succeeded had they not, in their arrogance, overlooked the fundamental principle that physical evidence cannot be entirely erased. The afternoon brought news from Inspector Lestrade confirming that the supernatural trust established by the fraudulent codicil had been formally dissolved, removing any lingering legal complications that might have clouded Miss Quinton's inheritance. Justice had been served with that thoroughness which the British legal system, despite its occasional failings, could achieve when properly guided by irrefutable evidence. As evening settled over London and the gaslight cast its familiar glow across our comfortable lodgings, Holmes reached for his violin with that fluid grace which marked his transition from professional investigation to private reflection. The first notes of a Bach partita filled the room, their mathematical precision providing a fitting commentary upon the logical processes that had unravelled the conspiracy. "Music and mathematics, Watson," he murmured, as his bow drew forth the complex harmonies that seemed to capture the very essence of ordered thought. Both reveal the underlying patterns that govern apparent chaos, whether in the realm of sound or in the darker territories of human motivation. I settled back to enjoy Holmes's musical interpretation of our recent adventure, reflecting upon the triumph of systematic investigation over elaborate deception. The bell that rang beneath the floor had indeed tolled, but not for the supernatural forces its creators had sought to simulate. Rather, it had summoned justice through the inexorable processes of logical deduction, proving once again that no crime, however ingeniously conceived, can long withstand the penetrating analysis of a truly scientific mind. The case was closed, its mysteries solved through the application of scientific method to criminal investigation. Yet, as Holmes's violin wove its intricate patterns through the comfortable silence of Baker Street, I knew that somewhere in London's teeming millions, new puzzles were already taking shape, waiting for that singular intellect to illuminate their darkest corners. The Carmelite bell would ring no more in service of deception, but would take its rightful place among the treasures of human history, where its true voice could speak of devotion rather than death, of scholarship rather than conspiracy, and of the enduring triumph of truth over even the most carefully constructed lies.